In this mini-lab, we're going to be building a countdown timer, which counts down to 0 before displaying a message. To accomplish this, we'll be using the interval, scan, map2, and filter operators. Let's get started. The first thing we need to do is create a stream which emits a value every 1 second. To handle this, we can use the interval creation operator. Let's go ahead and import this now from RxJS. Let's then create a variable called counter to represent the interval stream. Interval accepts a value, which is the time between emitted values in milliseconds. For our countdown, we'll supply 1000, so a new value will be emitted every second. Let's go ahead and subscribe to the counter observable, and just log the values to the console for now, to check out how this looks. As we can see, interval emits items in sequential order at the duration we supply. In our case, there's 1 second between each emission. So, what we would like to do is, instead of counting up, we want to count down starting at a given value. To do this, we need to store the current countdown value between each emission. Anytime you think of storing or accumulating state over time, the first operator you should think about is the scan operator. Scan allows us to keep track of the current countdown value, subtracting from it each time interval emits a value. Let's go ahead and import the scan operator from rxjs/operators now. Next, we will use the pipe method to add the scan operator to our counter stream. Scan takes a reducer function, which accepts the accumulator and current value, returning a new accumulated value. So what we could do is simply return the results of the accumulator -1 on each emission. This would give us the countdown behavior we are looking for. However, since we have already learned about the map2 operator, let's see how we can use this instead. Let's go ahead and add map2 to the rxjs/operators import. We can then add it to our pipe function above scan. On each emitted value from the counter stream, we're going to map to -1. Now, instead of hardcoding the accumulator -1 as our return value, we'll instead return the result of the accumulator plus the value being emitted, which will always be -1. We also need to supply a seed value for scan, so we have a starting point for the countdown. We can do this by providing a second parameter. For now, we're just going to start at 10. So instead of logging values to the console with subscribe, we instead want to update elements in the document to display the current countdown and final message. Let's go to our HTML file now and add an h2, which will assign an ID of countdown. Let's also add a div to display our final message. We'll give this an ID of message. Now, let's create a variable called countdown to hold a reference to the countdown element. To do this, we're going to call document.getElementById, passing it the ID of our countdown element. Let's also create a variable called message and do the same for the message container. Next, we just need to update the subscribe method to reactively update these elements on each emission. For the countdown element, we want to update the inner HTML on any value emitted from the source. For the final message, we only want to update when our countdown reaches 0. So if the value is falsy, we will update the inner HTML to say liftoff. Let's run this and see how it looks. We now have our counter and it starts counting down from 9. So what should happen is when we hit 0 here, our message should display based on the logic that we provided. And it does, it says liftoff. Now we actually see another problem because we have gone past 0. So we need to add an operator to fix this. Let's go ahead and comment out the subscribe method to stop our timer for now. So what we'd like to do is actually filter out any values that are less than 0. And we can do this by using the filter operator. Let's go ahead and import that from rxjs/operators. We can now come down and add the filter operator under scan. Filter accepts a predicate function, so we're going to provide a function that accepts the emitted value and returns true if the value is greater than or equal to 0. Now, let's uncomment out the subscribe function and rerun the example. So our counter now should count down to 0, then stop and display the message. And when we get to 0, you should not see any more negatives. And that's what happens, it stops and displays liftoff. So while this works, I want to point out some optimizations we can and will make moving forward as we learn about more operators. First, even though we are filtering out values less than 0 here, the counter continues running behind the scenes. What we really want is to complete the observable once this condition is met. We will learn how to do this with an operator in an upcoming lesson. Next, we could optimize our final message block by using an operator that only fires on observable completion, or by sharing our counter stream and creating a new stream which only emits a single end event. Finally, in future lessons, we will also learn how to add features like start, stop, pause, and reset into the timer example. To recap, interval emits a value every 1 second. For each value emitted, we map to -1. We then use scan to keep track of our timer state, emitting the current value -1. Finally, we can filter out any values less than 0 so the countdown will not enter negative numbers. All that's left to do is to update the display based on emitted values in our subscribe method.